Hey, this is Nev Lapwood from Snowboard Addiction, and this video is a tutorial on how to set up and mount a snowboard. So I've got two snowboards here, and these are two of my actual snowboards. This one is a 154, it's a twin tip park board. This board is a 156, and it's a directional, more of a power board. This board is using the Burden sliding system, the Burden EST slider, whereas this board is using the 4-hole traditional mounting system. So I'm going to show you the difference between setting up these two boards. So the first thing that you need to decide when you're setting up your snowboard is what is the position of your stance. This board is a board I ride in the park a lot. It's twin tip, which means that it rides the same switch as it rides regular. It's the same shape. So when I set this board up, I set my bindings up evenly over the board with the same amount of nose and tail so that it feels the same if I'm riding either regular or goofy. Whereas this board is a powder board. It is actually set up with the stance automatically set back slightly towards the tail. What that means is that you will have a smaller tail on this board and a larger nose, and it's intended to be rode that way. So there's a big difference right there in where I'm setting my bindings. Okay. The second thing you need to decide when setting up the stance of your board is how wide you want your stance to be. And this really comes down to personal preference, but I can give you a few tips to try to figure out how wide you can set your stance. Now, some boards will actually tell you what the reference stance is. So for example, this board is a Burden, it's called the Speed Date, and if you look at the binding, it tells you that the reference width is 22 inches wide. Now I know that in my riding, I like my width of my stance to be 21.5 inches wide. I am 5'9" tall, which is about 175 centimeters, somewhere about there. So if you're a similar height to me, you might want to try out that stance, maybe 21.5 inches wide, to see how that feels. If that feels too wide for you, bring it in a little bit. If it feels too narrow, feel free to bring it out. If you're taller than me, you might find you want to do a slightly wider stance than me, maybe 22 inches wide. Whereas if you're shorter than me, you could try a slightly narrower one. Now you can play around with this. There is definitely some times where stances are too wide and some stances that are too skinny. If your stance is too skinny, you may find that you won't have as much balance over your board. Whereas if your stance is too wide, it can actually restrict the amount of movement you have in your legs and could hinder your riding as well. So yeah, I'm 5'9". I like to ride at a 21.5 inch width board. And if you don't know what width you should be at, have a look on your board and see if it tells you if there's a reference stance width. In this case on the Burden board, it does tell you that. Now, once you have found your width that you like to be, so for example, on the Burden board it actually has an indicator that says ref. Ref stands for reference. So as I'm mounting that binding, I can look through this little plastic piece and I can line it up with the reference, and I know that I like mine to be 21.5, so I'm actually going to go in 1/4 of an inch on each binding. So reference would be 22 inches. If I go in 1/4 of an inch from the reference on each binding, that's now going to be 21.5 inches wide. If you have a tape measure, you can measure it. You don't need a tape measure, but quite handy. So I'm looking right now from the indicator on the binding through the little plastic piece to the other one, and I can see that my bindings are indeed 21.5 inches apart. I'm going from the very center of the binding to the very center of the binding. There's a little arrow on the indicator. Now, this board here is a Snowboard Addiction board. It's a custom board that we've made for our own riders, and we use them a lot in our videos. It doesn't have the reference stance written on it. So this one, when I set this board up, I will measure from center of the binding to the center of the binding to see what is my width of the stance. So I can see where I was mounted before, which is right there, and I can see that my front binding is still mounted. And I'm looking for my center point to be as close as possible to 21.5, which means I'm mounting on those screws. And you know, the whole stance width is a comfort thing. It's what you like to ride. I can't tell you exactly what's going to be better for you than other widths, but if you're ever out riding with me, I can look at your riding and give you my opinion. The third aspect you have to look at when mounting your bindings is what angles you want to ride at. So when you're putting a snowboard disc in, it's got all these little teeth, and depending on where you place those discs is going to be what angle you use on your bindings. So on most traditional four-hole mounting bindings, on most traditional four-hole bindings, every little tooth on the binding represents 3 degrees. So you'll quite often see it'll be 0, 9, 18, that's what it is on these ones, or it might be 6, 12, 18, but that's because each little piece is showing you a 3-degree movement. So I know that in my riding, I like to have 12 degrees on my front foot and -9 degrees on my back foot. What that means is that my front foot is facing forward and my back foot is facing backwards in the opposite direction. So I'm on 12, -9. That's a very normal-ish stance. Again, this comes down to personal preference on what different people like. Some people like to ride with both of their feet facing forwards, especially if they're like a snowboard racer. A lot of racers ride in that stance. Most freestylers, or almost all freestylers these days, are riding what's called a duck stance, which is a positive angle on the front foot and a negative angle on the back. So 12, 12, 15, 15, those are very normal stances. If you have no idea what you want your board to be at, try out what I do. I'm not saying it's the best. It's just a very neutral stance. I've got 12 degrees of angle on my front foot, -9 degrees on my back foot. And again, personal preference. You can change it around as much as you want to do. On the bird and sliding system, when you're looking for your bindings, you're not restricted by those 3-degree increments. You can actually go in any angle you want. And it has a little indicator on the back of the binding here which tells you what your angle is. So this one says 5, 10, 15. So I know that I like to go about -9, which means I'm going just before the 10 mark there to get that -9 angle. That's where I lock down my screws. Whereas on this 4-hole, I'm going for a -9, so that's 0, 3, 6, 9. And finding my 4-hole spots, that's where I'm going to lock my binding down into there to get my -9. Okay. The fourth aspect that you need to think about when you're setting your bindings to your board is your position of the bindings relative to your toe edge and your heel edge. And a lot of what this comes down to is your foot size. If you have a very normal size foot, say 8, 9, 10 male size foot, you can usually just mount your bindings right in the center. If you have a very small size foot, you're probably going to want to mount your bindings slightly more forward towards the toe edge. And if you have a very big size foot, you're probably going to want to mount your bindings back towards the heel edge. What this does, it helps to position your binding over the center of your board. Because when you're riding, you don't want to be too heavy towards your heel edge or too heavy towards your toe edge. You ideally want to have the weight of your body in the center of your board. And so if you mount your bindings and put your boots into the binding, and you find that your toes are really sticking out a lot over the toe edge, that's when you're going to want to move it back across the board to center it up. And likewise, if you find that it's sticking out more on the heel edge but not on the toe edge at all, you can move the binding forward to make it as central as possible. So, I found out where I want my stance to be, twin tip parkboard, powder board. I found out what I want my stance width to be. In this case for me, both times, 21.5 inches. I found out what my angles are. For me, it's usually pretty similar. I'm doing about 12 on my front foot, -9 on my back foot. And then I'm finding out, do I need to move my bindings towards the toe edge or towards the heel edge to make it central when I mount them. After you've done that, you're ready to lock them down. I got a little screwdriver here. I like this one, it's a small design that I actually carry this in my pocket when I'm riding all the time because it's pretty hard to fall on it. But it has 2 different size screwdrivers on it, which is pretty much all the different adjustments you need for your binding. And right now, I've got my binding lined up over the 4 holes. Line the 4 screws up. And then lock those screws down. And I'm generally tightening up my bindings to my board as tight as I can make it, because then you've got the least chance of it coming loose while you're riding. So that's a little video about how to mount your bindings to your board. I hope you found this useful. To get all of our full quality tutorials, make sure to go over to our website, snowboardaddiction.com. This is Nev Lapper from Snowboard Addiction. Our goal is to improve your riding.